Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's conversation, we're going to discuss generations, this one from a baby boomer perspective. What makes baby boomers unique? In what ways are they like other generations, and how are they different? And what are their views of other generations?
You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Joining me today is Chuck Mitchell, Senior Director of Content Quality here at the Conference Board, and a proud card-carrying member of the baby boomer generation. Chuck, welcome.
Well, thanks, Steve. Welcome. Glad to be here. And indeed, card-carrying.
But Chuck, I think the baby boomers is like the longest generation. I think it's 18 years, and you're kind of sitting roughly midway through that generation. So you'll give us a unique perspective on the whole generation. Tell us a little bit, though, before we start about your career and your life, and because I think that's you've had a really colorful and interesting set of experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Philly boy. I grew up in Northeast Philadelphia, kind of lower to middle class, and very isolated community. A trip to New Jersey was like a foreign trip for us, right? But
well, it still is for most, especially if you're in New York, I think, right?
Indeed, but pretty normal growing up, I guess, if you will, in that kind of era. But after college is where everything's kind of got interesting. I went to South Africa to play baseball, of all things, and they're kind of backed in. Now, this is the late 70s. So I backed into journalism while I was in South Africa, and that kind of changed my life. I was started with the Rand Daily Mail, which is the morning national daily in South Africa. And then I was later hired by United Press International, a global news agency. So I had time in Johannesburg. I did a year interestingly, in Rhodesia, then Zimbabwe, through that last year of the war and the transition. Then off to Nairobi. I was in Nairobi for 4 years, a lot of time during the famine years, 82 to 86 in Ethiopia and Sudan. I also spent quite a lot of time in Beirut after the second Israeli invasion in the 80s. And from there, I went to Moscow. I was 3 years in Moscow, the old Soviet Union, from 86 to 89. And Chernobyl was kind of my marker there. But and later on, I left UPI and joined the Detroit Free Press as the foreign editor there. I think what makes it kind of unique, that experience unique, is that I did get to live for extended periods in two of the oddest, if you will, government type systems: apartheid in South Africa and then communism in the Soviet Union. And it kind of really shaped my perspective into what I appreciate in Western countries, in the United States, about individual choice and freedoms. It's kind of interesting, that.
Yeah, and so your view of the baby boomer generation is not strictly of U.S. baby boomers, but it really is of baby boomers around the world. And, so that makes your experience really unique in that sense.
There are certainly commonalities among boomer generations globally, but there are a lot of differences. They're now culturally driven, in Europe, in Russia, certainly in most of Africa. So, again, the commonalities, but a lot of differences too.
Yeah, so, the generation is entitled the baby boomer generation, and it's really because there was a, higher fertility rate following World War II. People coming back, getting back to normal, and there were a lot of births during that era. Talk about what you think are the characteristics of your generation.
Yeah, again, generalizations are hard, but I think pretty strong work ethic by and large. I think my contemporaries, my peers, have always been kind of global, goal oriented. Competitive in that sense, that there is a striving not only for your own personal good, but I think this generation likes to compare itself to other people within that generation. It's that keeping up with the Joneses kind of notion too. I think I see that a lot in my peers. I think we're more independent than previous generations, but in some ways too, we're more independent than later generations. I think the independence is the thing that kind of marks my generation. We're curious and resourceful and willing to get out on our own and do things, try things, make things.
The generation, but baby boom generation spans the birth years 1946 to 64. Those earlier baby boomers really had an easier time, I think, in the workforce because there was a dearth of population just prior to that. But beginning, mid-generation where you are and later, there were a lot of people. I mean, there was never a shortage for labor. And so when you talk about the competitiveness, you had to be because there was just so many, how many people were behind you always to take your job?
Right. It's that, that don't look over your shoulder because someone's gaining on you. I think that's one of the mantras of our generation.
Yeah. And so there was a bit of a hunger there too, because you really had to distinguish yourself and that, through hard work and put points on the board as you would say, and, in order to really move yourself ahead economically.
Yeah, definitely so. And I think that's where that self-reliance and independence part really comes in. Again, throughout our upbringing, I think as a generation, when you look at the sports, we're all competitive. It was this notion around you have to be better than the person next to you, person behind you, person in front of you. And that I think is one of the characteristics of the generation is it becomes we became a little selfish.
The whole media world, you were in, you were in journalism. The whole media world changed during your lifetime and your career. Talk about that, because when you were born, the TV was just starting to come up and, the penetration was very low and it was all black and white in the 50s and all of that. So talk about that and media writ large.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, as I grew up, and even in up until my final years, I think at the Free Press, people trusted the media. I mean, you go back to the Walter Cronkites of this world, where when they spoke, it was gospel. Seeing the transition in newspapers, the advent of the internet, alternative sources. Really started to undermine credibility. I think the citizen journalism thing really undermined credibility in established media, and the media itself was to blame. I mean, I remember at the Detroit Free Press, when we would sit around for our morning planning meetings, everyone was a Democrat. I was the only registered Republican, and it was dissenting voice. And I think that there was a lot of groupthink that came into national media, and that could be part of the reason it undermined its own credibility to some extent. That in those days, the Detroit Free Press was 400,000 daily circulations, 10th largest in the country, and today it's probably under 100,000.
Well, yeah, I mean, but that was typical of the baby boomer generation too. I mean, you mentioned Walter Cronkite. There was 3 networks, and the news program was 15 minutes once per day, during the evening hour. No other news at all, and it was just really brief. This is what happened, and that's the way it was. Literally, that's what Walter would say. And then there was the newspaper, and those were in the days when it was paper,
right?
And it was news. And it was delivered to your doorstep once a day, or in some cities twice a day. But that's how people consumed news in that era.
No, I have to confess, I still get a hard copy of the Wall Street Journal, and when I go into the city, I am the only person on that Metro North train that is folding pages. Everyone else is reading electronically, but. There are many pockets in the world. I'm thinking of the UK, India, for example, where it's like it was here in the 60s, 50s, and 60s when it comes to the credibility of the newspaper. You can't get away in those countries without starting your morning by reading those newspapers.
But you've had to, like every baby boomer, go from black and white television news for 15 minutes a day, and now you're right there with everybody else on social media and using your thumbs to communicate. Talk about that whole transition.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is a major transition, and I think I've been very conscious of not allowing it to try and control my life. There's very much an echo chamber. You're defined by what networks you tune into, what radio commentators or podcasts you listen to. And I think one of the big differences is that in my generation or growing up is that there was some exposure to, whether you did it personally, to people who thought differently than you couldn't avoid it. Now you can avoid it. I mean, it is that classic echo chamber. And there's an individual responsibility to be curious about other points of view. And I'm not sure that it takes a lot of self-discipline to do that.
Yeah, and the whole family formation has changed too, because the households were larger when you were a kid, and even when you started having kids, it was larger. It's become smaller now. It was more suburban, right? And
Right.
I don't know if you agree with this, but it seems like it was more middle class. I mean, people were kind of all in the same income groups. You didn't have the huge disparities. If you look at the houses that were built in the 50s, they were all kind of the same size, and but that's all kind of changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has, I mean, this, the notion around a wealth gap. But I think, for my parents in particular, they were both ex-military. They had both served in the Pacific during World War II. My mother was a lieutenant in the Navy Nurse Corps on hospital ships out in the Pacific. My dad was on destroyers out there. And when they finished up, when they came home, there was a full kind of sense of community. There was an optimism, this notion around an American dream and picket fence and houses that was pretty real to them. And that was the goal. That's what they strive for. And that was very much, and there's a greater sense of community. I remember growing up in my neighborhood in Philly, everybody looked after each other. My great aunt, the neighbors, when she got into her 90s, were doing her shopping for her, checking in on her every day, not family members, just neighbors. And I don't see that almost anywhere in the US these days.
Did your people in your neighborhood lock the doors in their house?
No. In the later years, when I was young, no. In later years, yes.
Yeah.
There was there was a kind of transition. There was a fear that started to creep in. But by and large, I remember it being pretty open. You walked into your neighbor's house.
And how many siblings did you have?
I just have one sister. She's older. She was at the very beginning of that generation.
Yeah. And so did your parents just sort of let you go out and play and run around the neighborhood, or did they know where you were ever?
No, and that's they opened the door, you went out. Boy, you better be home by 5 o'clock when it was supper time. We used to eat early, and that's when my dad got home. So it was you got on your bike and you went. We had a neighborhood full of kids, and we just went and did things, and pick up baseball games, and going into the park, and never any thought, never any fear. I never felt in danger to, I felt, I had decision-making responsibility when I was 10. Where am I going to go today? And how am I going to get there? When we were young, we used to go, when we were 12 years old, we would get on 2 buses and a trolley and go to Philadelphia Phillies baseball games, and we're 12 years old.
And when you were riding the bike, did you wear a helmet?
No, although my sister, who's a trauma psychologist, would say that was stupid even back then. But no,
Yeah,
they
but
didn't
I
have
mean
them.
that was the sense. It wasn't, it was a different sense of security then.
Oh, yeah, very, very much so. I mean, interestingly, I think, I had a lot of external anxiety coming from events that I picked up from my parents, stuff like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and but in the neighborhood, no, there weren't any bad people, right? You didn't know they were bad people.
You talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but you know, in the baby boomer generation, right after World War II is when, there was Korea, and then, a little later there was Vietnam for the later part of the generation, but it was the whole nuclear age, beginning in 1945, of course, with the end of World War II and the bombings in Japan. But, they used to train baby boomers to go to the shelter. There were fallout shelters everywhere, or get underneath your desk, which I think is the most ridiculous thing. What are you going to do? You're going to just, but they used to drill on this kind of stuff, which they don't talk about anymore. So there's a big fear of nuclear holocaust then.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely, and it was very real to me. And my mother, because of her military background and nursing skills, was a civil defense warden in our neighborhood. And the generations won't remember, but there were those little yellow signs with the triangle, right? That designated this is a nuclear shelter. Get in. And we had one in our basement, and it was stocked full of Campbell's soup and dried canned goods and all those sorts of things. And it was very, that part was very real to me. And certainly in school, those drills of get under your desk, make sure you close the shades so you won't be blinded by the explosion. Well, if you can see the explosion, we know.
Yeah, you're gonna be melted to the desk.
Right.
No, it is interesting because the notion of security was really one extreme or the other. I mean, you felt secure in your own neighborhood and your own area, but you feared this thing from afar, I guess, and superpowers and things happening that could happen to you from long distances.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, a sense of not having any control over those, those external events. But, I remember my parents watching that black and white television intently for each move. And I was 9 years old then, I guess, and I had this sense of relief when it was over. That I still kind of remember, almost, when the equivalent would be like winning the Super Bowl. It was just, everything was kind of lifted off your shoulders. And I remember that distinctly.
We've discussed some of the characteristics of the baby boom generation. Next, we're going to explore how the generations differ. We'll take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Chuck Mitchell, the Senior Director of Content Quality here at the Conference Board, and a baby boomer, born right in the middle of the generation. Now, the whole space era happened, when you were a kid. I mean, I smile now when I read about all this space junk, that it's so cluttered up there that you can't move without getting hit by something. But you were there and watched the very first satellite launch, the very first one.
Yeah. Well, everybody knows Sputnik, right? The Soviet basketball-sized thing that went up and did a couple of orbits and beeped a few times, and that was, oh my God, we're toast, right, in the U.S. And that's part of what defined a generation is our faith in technology too, right? I mean, as it was making things better, and that there was a commitment, I think, in the whole country, and certainly among my generation, that we can do this, and everybody, some way or another might be able to contribute to getting a man on the moon, as Kennedy promised before 1970, right, before the end of '69, and there was such pride in what we achieved. I remember being really puffed up about beating my chest. You can't beat us, and that. I think that was one of the U.S.'s finest hours.
Well, and President Kennedy made that statement at 1961, we're going to put a man on the moon and return him. There was no sense of diversity, but him safely. And, and you were there. I mean, you listened to this. What was the reaction of your family and everybody when he said that? I mean, it was a little bit incredible, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we had kind of a neighborhood watch party, what they call today, right? But not everybody had TV sets, and everybody, quite a few neighbors came over, and again, it was just this sense of pride that we are. It was we are doing it, not they. We are doing it, and boy, everybody felt good for a long time, and we just kind of marveled at our, the technology ability to do that. And as we know now, right? I mean, there was very little. You have way more in your cell phone than what they had when they were going up to the moon. So, it was just a sense it really pulled the community, and not just our community, but I think across the U.S. this great sense of achievement, pride. We can do anything, and that was kind of one of the definers.
Now, humans have been developing for a million years before your generation, but they started really talking about the concept of generations just in two groups before you. One was what they called the greatest generation, 1901 and 1927, and then the silent generation, which was 1928 to 1945. So they're two big Isn't it interesting, Chuck, that the first generation who started this whole scheme named themselves the greatest generation?
I don't think they were self-named. I haven't. Was it Tom Brokaw who wrote that book of The Greatest Generation about the sacrifices that group did? And again, both my parents serving in the military and serving out, in the Pacific Theater in action, that the sacrifices and that they made, when you think of the call-ups and the volunteers that wanted to serve during the Second World War, and you contrast that with the draft situation in one of the defining events for my generation, the Vietnam War, right, where yes, a lot of people were called up and served proudly, but a lot of people were heading to Canada and out the door and looking for ways to get deferments. And I think that's the big contrast between those two generations, the willingness to serve and sacrifice for a common good. And then our group who, well, it doesn't suit me, so I'm not going to get involved. And my draft number was 265. My college roommate got number 4 in the lottery and signed up for ROTC, and I breezed through. So,
yeah, you slipped. Now, after the baby boomers, there was Generation X, Y, and Z. Generation Y is also referred to as Millennials. Z and the babies being born today are Generation Alpha, so they're starting all over again. But so there are really 3 big generations after you. Do you view them distinctly differently, or do you kind of think of all of them as being the same from your perspective?
Yeah, and that, I almost anyone younger that falls outside of my generation comes later. It's hard for me to distinguish. I think the Xers, the Zers and Xers are maybe a little easier to distinguish, but the millennial side is no. They all kind of
look alike to you. So, and how are they the same or different than what you experienced in the baby boom?
Yeah, I mean, I think the differences really come in they're a little more appreciative of their balance, right? They think our generation, again, being really kind of so goal oriented, strong work ethic, tended to have a great trust in the system, if you will, and devoted a lot of their lives, sunk a lot of their identity into their jobs, what they did, who they made them, who they were to some extent. And I think the generations that came afterwards, not so much. It's one of the things that I admire about those later generations is that seeking of more balance. They saw how absorbed the generation before was in their work, and part of it was to provide, right? It's life stage, right? You have a family, you need to provide. But I think there's more sense of self in later generations, and willingness to indulge oneself, and that's probably healthier in the long run than what happened to us.
There's been so much written about the differences in generations, But as I hear you talk, you talk about the generations that came before you. They were older than you at the time, and therefore they'd accomplished, they'd sacrificed, they'd gone through 2 world wars. The generations that are younger than you are younger, and so they're at a different life stage. And I just wonder how much of it, Chuck, is just due to life stage. I mean, were boomers really different than today's Gen Z at the same stage in life?
I really do, especially when the generation before us, the greatest generation, silent generations, were, I think, extraordinarily rigid. And not only in a family sense, but also in a societal sense. And their approach was it's our way or the highway, and to some extent, right? Even when they were younger, there were rigid beliefs. There was a firmness and unshakability in what they believed in. And I think it started with the boomers starting to question that rigidity, and now we get up to later generations who I think are more flexible, willing to adapt than earlier generations. I think those are the big differences. I think when you talk about life stage, there can't be a lot of differences when you have a family and you have a mortgage and you have responsibilities. It pushes everyone into a kind of similar behavior. I mean, you can't go out and do everything that you want to do because you have those responsibilities. So I think, to that extent, that there's a lot of commonality in life, in life stages within the generations.
Yeah. So, when people look back and look at the baby boomer generation, what are the, handful, a couple of events, historic events that they're going to say, yeah, those were defining moments in that generation?
Yeah, I think certainly, I think the Vietnam War was a really big definer for my generation in so many ways, and I think for society overall, I think that was the beginning of this kind of polarization that we see now in the U.S. Myself, I was more naive. I was neither anti-war nor pro-war. I started to see that not a viciousness, perhaps, but certainly a polarization of, if you were against the war, you were against America. If you were, for the war, you were a patriot. And I think that's where this polarization, when I was thinking about it, it begins to surface, I think, in a national scale.
So obviously you won't be here 100 years from now, but when people are writing about or talking about the baby boom generation 100 years from now, I'm just, whatever, I'm just trying to go out far enough that they're looking back. What do you think they will say about the baby boom generation?
Self-criticism is never easy, but I think they'll look back and say, well, maybe they blew it, right? We blew it. We were coming off, a great period of optimism and growth among the previous generations. And we had all this technology, we had rising wealth, we had a desire to change society for the good. And then we ran out of gas. When do you think when do you think that started to happen, where we ran out of gas? Around what time period? I think for our generation, when you look back, even early on, right, in that generation, the wasn't one event, but I think it was a series of events. Think of the political assassination, the Kennedys, Martin Luther King, just kind of started to take the wind out of our sails a little bit. That hope for progress, there's always some obstacle, there's some bad person out there that's going to try and stop it. But I really think that post Vietnam War, we just started to see that all that change that had been hoped for earlier on in that period wasn't going to happen, and now we got to hunker down and look after our families and job responsibilities, and that just kind of, we were disappointed in ourselves that we didn't get more done when we had the opportunity, and events just responsibilities overwhelmed.
Well, it'll be interesting. I mean, it's really interesting to hear, the self-criticism, but I wonder if 100 years from now it will look quite the same. We won't know because we won't be here, but I wonder if it will look quite as bleak, or whether people will remember, the great technological breakthroughs and medical breakthroughs and so forth that were made in this generation. We'll see. We'll see when somebody plays this podcast 100 years from now. They can tell us, right, whether we were accurate or not.
Well, it seems like revisionist history is always downward, right? So
I don't know. You elevated the greatest generation and agreed with their own naming. So,
well, in some ways, they were right, and
yeah, they were your heroes. Yeah, you can see it. Chuck Mitchell, thanks very much for joining us today and telling us your story.
Well, thanks, Steve. It was great, and it was really nice to have time for that kind of self-reflection. It meant a lot. Thanks a lot.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in economics, geopolitics, public policy, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with all of your colleagues, your friends of every generation. I know they're going to want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.